Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Charles, are the papers for signature on your desk? The secretary reported to Camille, a pretty girl with blue eyes and long blonde hair. Contrary to stereotypes, she was smart, special. High school education. She hadn't been able to find a job in her specialty, so she had come to work for Charles. The man nodded and walked quickly into the office. There was indeed a blue folder on the desk. He without looking at the crooked signature and sat down tiredly at the desk. Pressing the call button, Charles asked Camille to send his deputy James over. James was not only the second man in the company after Charles, but also his best friend. The men had met about 10 years ago when Charles was just starting his career as a businessman and had opened a small apartment remodeling firm. The man hired James as a mere assistant. When the firm began to bear fruit, but over time the men became friends. The assistant turned into a deputy and the deputy into a son-in-law. After marrying Charles' sister Emily, the family spent every weekend and holiday together. Now, when the man had doubts, he decided to call his friend to get what he hoped was sound advice. James entered the office with a smile on his face, hoping for good news, but was immediately met with a frown from Charles, who sat slumped in a chair. Black hair. The men's was shot and falling into a bob, and terribly tired eyes, plain black and perfectly aligned suit. Right now it looked like something between second-hand stuff, out of plate memorabilia rags. James walked to the closet where the safe stood and took out a small bottle of cognac and 2 glasses for the drink. He placed the glasses on the table and silently poured the brandy. Charles took one of them and drank it in one gulp. After a few minutes of thought, James asked. Charles took a deep breath and shook his head. Emily. She put her elbows on the table and rested her head on her hands. She recently gave birth. And I was sure there couldn't be anything more joyous than Mason's birth. But, I'm not saying he doesn't look like me or Emily. It can be written off to the fact that he is small, but the bone of his eyes is pitifully mouthed by the man. They're not brown, they're not blue like Emily's. They're green. No one in my lineage had green eyes. Neither did Emily's parents. I don't know what to think. Emily is a beautiful, intelligent girl who just over a year ago became Charles' wife. The girl was 15 years younger than the man, but that didn't bother him. He was sure of their feelings. No. He understood perfectly well that the girl had chosen him not out of the goodness of her heart, but by the size of her purse. But she did come from a well-to-do family, and Charles decided that she would make a good wife. The girl almost immediately became pregnant, and 8 months later she gave birth to a child. He was born prematurely. Although Charles often joked that this rich man is bigger than the other children of his age will be. At first, the man could not be happy with the baby. He wanted him and cherished him. He tried to come early from work and be at home on weekends to see the first smiling words or steps. But as time went on, doubts began to muffle the man. The eyes were green in color. The girl wrote it off to her grandfather and, happy with the birth of his son Charles, believed it. But soon he overheard a conversation between the maid and the gardener. Yes, that's right. I'm telling you. A full-figured woman in a large white apron spoke quietly. She was standing by the stove and hanging soup, talking to the gardener. Not his, it's the baby. I was a nurse in the maternity ward for 10 years. I've seen more premature babies than I can count. This one's more of a carrier. She announced right after the wedding that she was pregnant. I guess she was afraid she wouldn't make it in time. And eye to eye. Who's seen it? The woman exclaimed. It's not their kind of eyes. Just so you know. Charles overheard this conversation by chance, but it made him so angry that he dismissed both the maid and the gardener the same evening for insulting the host family. As time went on, however, doubt began to show itself in Charles's thoughts. He looked at the child more and more often with a thoughtful long look, trying to figure out if it was his child or not. He searched for information about eye color and found only that parents with brown and blue eyes could not be born with green eyes. Then doubts began to eat the man from the inside, and he came to his best friend in the hope that he would give good advice. However, deep in his soul there was still a belief that Charles was wrong. Emily, smart and educated girl. Do you think she would do such a thing? Would she have wanted to be tied to you so badly? James rubbed his chin thoughtfully and shook his head. No, I don't think so. What I don't think is that she could have gotten pregnant by accident. You saw that Mason didn't look like a premature. You and I aren't experts, Dim, but still. James volleyed the last sip of cognac and took the bottle to its place. Today, the negotiations with Chinese partners are enough. And about Mason, make DNA and don't torture yourself. Exhaled the man. Charles thought about it. The next few days were spent thinking about whether it was worth doing the test. If it turned out that the child, his then Emily, would be furious. But the doubts didn't want to leave Charles' poor head. He thought about it all the time. He began to come home late, experiencing the displeased looks of his wife. The boy cried constantly at the sight of his father and didn't seem to want to see him anymore. It was as if he sensed a change in attitude towards him. Slightly, Charles, too, began to quarrel without cause. The couple took it out on each other every now and then. After another big fight, Charles went into the boy's room and swabbed what he hoped was his son's mouth with a cotton swab. Mason immediately began to cry, calling for his mother. Emily didn't take long to arrive, immediately jogging over to the child's cries. She grabbed the boy and glared angrily at her husband and ran off. Charles slumped his shoulders tiredly. His gaze faded. He clutched the plastic vial in his hand, not wanting to look at it. He had wanted children for a long time. Even though he was immersed in work, he dreamed of a large and full family since childhood, but somehow it hadn't worked out. Emily was a hope that was beginning to fade in front of his eyes. The next day, Charles told Camille to send the vial to the clinic where the test should be done. Only 2 days were given for the wait. The man paid for the express test. However, even those days were agony for him. He checked his mail and phone several times a day, waiting for a letter or a call. At home, Charles was not himself, not even speaking to his wife and asking for dinner to be served in the study, where he tried to immerse himself in his work to distract himself. He refused to see Mason at all, citing illness. In fact, looking at the boy was both physically and mentally painful. My stomach twisted, and the memory of Charles taking Mason's saliva came back to mind. 2 days passed waiting. However, when the letter with the tests arrived, the man did not notice him, Camille reported. The girl was sorting through her supervisor's mail. Camille, seeing the name of the organization, did not read further, for which the man was very grateful to her. He decided to open the letter alone when no one else was around, just him and his thoughts. It was a long wait. Camille had left too late, and James dropped in every now and then to check on his friend, to see how he was doing. Charles drank almost the entire bottle of cognac during the evening. By the time the office was empty, he was drunk. Glassy eyes stared at a piece of paper and slightly belligerent hands nervously tried not to crumple it. Charles read his name, then his son's name, then a long canvas of names he didn't understand. And finally he got to the most important thing. Result: 0%. A figure that settled in Charles' mind. He found another bottle in the table and opened it. Tonight she put it down. Overnight, Charles remained so in the office, not wanting to go home. A little boy with a short bundle on his head and huge green eyes was dressed in a blue suit with butterflies on his chest and blue shoes, with which he kicked his mother's stomach every now and then. A loud scream came out of the boy's tiny mouth every second and grew louder and louder, but no one paid any attention to it. The child's mother, dressed in a red robe, only finished the boy faster, continuing to look at her husband with incomprehension. "What kind of nonsense are you talking about, Charles?" The girl's voice was almost breaking into a scream. "Mason, your son. How could you think he wasn't? Do you really distrust me that much? No more lies." "Emily," the man exclaimed. He didn't look at the boy, his gaze fixed on his wife. There would be no more lies, because Charles ran his hand into his pants pocket. He pulled out a soft piece of paper and unfolded it right down the middle. There was a huge stain from the night's brandy spills. Charles tossed the paper to his wife. She caught it awkwardly and began to read. In a second, the look in her blue eyes faded. Her face relaxed. Emily lowered her head, and the hand holding the paper powerlessly dropped. She pulled the boy tighter against her, and tears flowed from her eyes. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered softly. Charles sank down on the chair and shook his head. He rubbed his face tiredly with his hand, swollen after a night on the office couch. "Why? Did you really feel bad? Did I treat you badly? How could it be so easy?" The girl put the child on the couch and sat next to him. She put her elbows on her knees and grabbed her long blonde hair with her hands. "It was an accident." The girl exhaled. "It's a guy from work. He was before you a long time ago. We loved each other, then broke up. But a couple days before the wedding, we met again, and..." Emily lingered, shifting her gaze to the boy. "And what happened happened. I thought it was the last time I'd go out, and that was it. But after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. I wanted to have an abortion, but the doctor said that if I did that, I would never be able to have children again, and I couldn't go through with it. I had to lie." The last words came especially hard to Luca. She swallowed the stringy saliva and shook her head. "What about the doctors? They all claimed the baby was premature, but money to them. What else is there?" Emily grinned. "I paid everyone who knew I'd given birth at term. It wasn't hard. Doctors don't get paid that much. Turns out who knew? No one. Just me and the doctors. I didn't want to lie to you, but I couldn't tell you the truth either. You would have kicked me out." There was silence. Charles didn't know what to say. Didn't see the point. Emily was not a stupid girl. Perfectly realizing that she was no longer Charles' wife, she silently got up from the couch, took the still crying boy, and went to the second floor. Also silently, the girl gathered her things and left. She stood in front of the house for a long time and looked up, where Charles was watching her from the window. Emily met his gaze with one lip and whispered, "I'm sorry," and left. The boy continued to cry. One leaving was easier, and the news that Mason was not Charles' son did not go away. The other day, another letter arrived from the same clinic where the DNA test was done. Camille, like the last time, silently forwarded the letter to the supervisor without asking a word. After the negotiations, Charles sat tiredly alone in his office and decided to open the letter. He was sure that there was nothing important in it. However, it again contained certificates and tests. A frown spread across his face. Charles began to read. When he finished, he couldn't think adequately. His dreams of a happy family shattered into small pieces in a matter of seconds. Infertility. The diagnosis in the letter the clinic had sent him. Lack of sperm activity, a clear and accurate diagnosis. Charles tipped back his head and sighed. Outwardly, he was perfectly calm. Inside, however, everything was turning upside down for him. Several months had passed since Emily had left. The couple quickly divorced and separated, as if they had never known each other. Charles' life continued as usual. He completely immersed himself in his work, completely forgetting about his personal life. James came to Charles during his lunch break, while the whole office went to the local coffee shop for a business lunch. Those who stayed behind were immersed in their work. The corridors were almost empty, with only the northern corridors filled with the quiet exclamations of the receptionists, who seemed to James not to have left their desks at all. They looked like zombies with pale skin and huge blue circles under their eyes. James walked into his friend's office and whistled. Charles was sitting behind a pile of papers and contracts, and next to him stood about half a dozen coffee cups. Seriously, oh man, you're a piece of work. There's a negotiation in 300 hours, and you decided to have a heart attack. Charles looked up at his friend and shook his head. Not James. Spent all night translating the contract. Didn't get an hour's sleep. When are you going to hire a new translator? Today's the day. Today's the day she's supposed to come in to negotiate. The best one who sent in a resume could have sent in part of the contract. I could help. Charles waved his hand and went back to his papers. James, hoping to take a friend out for lunch, realized that it wasn't going to work out. He sat down next to Charles and took a portion of the contract to check everything out. Jacob, the company's translator, ended up in the hospital with both legs broken after the accident. Naturally, he couldn't go to work anymore. This happened 3 days before an important negotiation with the French. Charles knew the language, but more on a conversational level than a professional one. Thank the gods. Jacob had translated almost the entire contract. However, there were some gaps that Charles himself had to sit up all night with. At 3 o'clock, Charles and James were fully prepared to negotiate, and all the documents had been double-checked. Together, they went to meet the French, who arrived just in time. But the new translator was late. "Where is your best interpreter?" Charles asked nervously. James averted his eyes. The girl was late, threatening to undermine the negotiations. Although Charles knew fluent French with simultaneous translation, he did not, which was unfortunate. Negotiations could break down if one of the parties kept interjecting and thinking for minutes at a time, trying to translate the answer correctly. The French delegation consisted of 3 people: a fat man in a gray suit, a tall girl in red, and a young guy with huge glasses. According to Charles, the man in gray is Sam and the girl is his daughter Evelyn. No one knew the guy. Most likely he was a personal translator or someone else, obviously not directly involved in the management of the company. Charles, smiling broadly, said hello to Sam, Evelyn, and the guy who had been introduced as Jacques. Sam said something quickly in French, waiting for a response. The guy turned out to be an assistant, not a translator. Charles translated half of Sam's question, trying to answer. He was clearly confused, not knowing what to do. He also later mouthed off on his own. A girl ran from the side of the bus stop. Her long red hair was gathered in a strict bundle. She herself was dressed in office blue suits and high, thin stiletto boat shoes. Sam smiled at the girl's response and mumbled something else. He said he was hungry after the airplane and wouldn't mind having lunch before the negotiations. The girl translated. James immediately stepped forward. "Tell them we'll set it up now. Camille called that restaurant on Nevsky. Book a table and the most expensive dinner." "Got it." Camille nodded often and took a quick step aside, dialing a number on her phone. The translator translated the answer to the French. They nodded and returned to the car. The girl turned to Charles and James and said hello. "But where were you negotiating?" "Almost failed. I'm sorry, James. There was an accident on the bridge. I had to go around. I didn't do it on purpose." "All right," Charles waved goodbye. "The important thing is that you're here. So let's get acquainted. I'm Charles, CEO and founder of the firm you're working for now. Next time you're late, I won't tolerate it." That's a clear nod from the girl. "I am a responsible and professional employee. It's just a small embarrassment. It won't happen again." I hope Charles jumped. If he had a backup translator under his belt, he would definitely either fire this girl or make a scandal. But there was no time now. Camille came running in to confirm Charles's thoughts, informing him that the table had been reserved and most of the food would be ready for them when they arrived. Charles, James, and the translators headed for the cars to head to the restaurant. "What's her name?" asked James Charles. "In case you didn't know, Charles, I'm here too." "You can ask me." "I'm Jenna. I'm Jenna." "Jenna, if that's your company policy. If not, Jenna, nice to meet you. And I hope your mom taught you not to talk about people in the third person," she said sharply and got in the back seat of the car, closing the door behind her. James smirked at Charles and sat down in the front seat next to the driver. The descriptive Charles stood in front of the car for a couple seconds, but next sat down next to Jenna. The negotiations went quite decently. The contract was signed on terms favorable to both sides. French went to the hotel, and Charles, James, and Jenna left the restaurant closed for special service in the open air. The time was late. The sun had long since risen, and the moon had come out to dominate the sky. The streetlights illuminated the asphalt, and the cold wind was a reminder that it was already fall. "Thank you, Jenna," James nodded. "You were on time and professional, just like you said you would be. That's my job." James Vyacheslavovich Fortune Girl and approached the curb, putting out his hand. Seeing Charles' interested look, she replied, trying to catch a cab. "Charles, not everyone has a private driver. Good afternoon. I'm going to Kronstadt 15. "Yes, thank you very much. We could take you home," Charles said. "It's silly to offer soup after pie. Isn't it, Charles?" "See you tomorrow," said Jenna and got into the yellow car. James nodded to the girl, and Charles only exhaled noisily through his nose. "She seems to have laid siege to you again." Old man James grinned. Charles only sent his friend away. Jenna was translating for her new boss, trying to figure out who had done the last draft wrong. It looked more like a Brittany amateur than a professional job. Thoughts were planted in the girl's head that her boss had done it, witnessing the broken accent she had become. Charles was not to the girl's liking, although she could not deny his external qualities and managerial talent. Except that he thought he was right in all situations. It was maddeningly annoying. Jenna was probably too much of a character. That's why she was fired from her last job. But she wasn't going to stand for neglect, and the new boss reeked of it. The office that Anna was given was small, but it was fully equipped. James had forbidden to change anything because he was waiting for the past interpreter to return, and the whole room was filled with his things. On the table were several frames with his pictures, and under the table was a beer bottle. Jenna grinned as she noticed her boss and his deputy in one of the pictures. In this firm, friendship clearly played not the least role. She went to the next negotiations with enthusiasm, having studied the information about the people whose speech she would have to translate. Jenna basically liked to do it to understand what a person was saying. You have to understand what he thinks, an integral principle of all good interpreters. The negotiations were this time in an office in a small room where a presentation was displayed on a screen. Charles was broadcasting to a company of a dozen people, including Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Germans. The English had their own interpreter about the advantages of their goods, but the Germans did not. Jenna regretted that she had indicated German in her resume, because she had to repeat the information in that language as well. By the end of the presentation, which lasted more than 3 o'clock, Jenna was, "You're like a lemon." Charles announced that everyone could be excused until tomorrow, and she set off to pack her things to go home to a soft bed and a hot bath. It was the best relief after a long, hard day. "Jenna, are you going somewhere? Coming from behind?" asked James. Jenna jerked in fright and dropped her lipstick. She turned around and saw her boss and his deputy. Not that she missed them. After all, they had been at the presentation together. "Home. James Vyacheslavovich, is there something that surprises you?" The men looked at each other, and a smile blossomed on Charles' face. He smirked, waiting for his friend's answer. "It seems that your working day ends only at 17 o'clock, doesn't it?" "Jenna? Yes, but everyone involved in the negotiations has already left or is about to. Hinted at by my superiors. Plus, I found out from coworkers that the last interpreter left the workplace as soon as the negotiations were over, no matter what time they ended. First of all, you're not Jacob, you've only been with the firm for a few days." James began to explain quietly. "And secondly, no one let you go. Or do you want to lose your paycheck?" A semblance of a smile appeared on Jenna's face. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. "You're not going to pay me extra for translating into German?" "No. However, I am on the payroll as a French translator. I've been talking nonstop and switching from one language to another. Synchronized rest. But you want to make me stay? Fine, I'll do it." Jenna defiantly put her purse away and sat down to her papers. She was tired and had a headache, but she wasn't going to argue anymore. If her superiors let everyone go but her, she would obey. "Excuse me, Jenna. There's a voice. Charles, it's probably wrong that everyone went home and you didn't. You're not going to get anything done in the remaining 40 minutes of work time. So you can go home." Jenna raised her eyes to the man and shook her head. "No, thank you. I'll do my allotted time." Charles wanted to object, but she was already at work. The men left her office, leaving behind an unpleasant vibe. On the one hand, they shouldn't have argued with their superiors about anything. However, she heard them announce that everyone who had taken part in the presentation could leave early. She didn't understand why it didn't concern her. Situations like this repeated themselves several times. It was as if the bosses had turned against the girl, but she didn't understand why in past companies she was disliked for her difficult character. But here she had not yet had time to show it. She had to put up with the prejudice of her superiors. At the same time, Jenna often noticed Charles watching her. It was as if he was looking for something to pick on. After another exit negotiation, Jenna left the office and walked towards the bus stop. The restaurant wasn't that far from home, and she would catch the bus. Taking public transportation 2 stops away was much easier than waiting for a cab, and much cheaper. By the end of the month, the money had miraculously evaporated. Una called out Charles. James was not negotiating this time, just a pretty assistant. Jenna, will you walk home? What do you care, Charles? You didn't seem very interested in how I was getting home before. Not at all. I'm taking Camille home. I can give you a ride too. I think the rain's coming down. Don't you think? Jenna raised her eyes skeptically to the sky, where there were only a couple of clouds, and shook her head. Then she looked at the bus passing by and at the boss's shiny new car. The choice had been made. Jenna sat in the back seat next to Camille, who was busily digging through her purse. I think she lost something. You live around here, right? Have you read my file? Jenna asked in surprise. I read the personnel files of all my employees, Charles replied. To which Jenna raised an eyebrow skeptically. All right, everyone I work with on a regular basis. So I'm right. Yes, Jenna was interrupted by Camille. Charles, I can't find my medicine. My mom called and she's out of it, and she's not feeling well. I bought a pack this morning, but I think I lost it somewhere. We can. Camille was talking very fast and very excited. She clutched her purse tightly, looking in the rearview mirror where Charles' eyes were visible. The man looked questioningly at Jenna, who only waved her hand without saying a word. Charles turned the car around and drove toward the drugstore. A few minutes later, Camille was already running to get the medicine, while Jenna and Charles were left alone in the car. An awkward silence ensued, which Jenna broke. It was worth taking the bus. Quiet, she muttered. Well, I guess I can't make up for the time you took the cab home. Jenna smiled. Is that how you make amends? For what? You don't seem to be obligated to drive employees home, do you? That's rude at the very least, Charles replied. I drove you to that restaurant, and I have to drive you back. Jenna poked, eliciting a chuckle from her superiors. Camille was running late at the drugstore, and she decided to ask the question that had been on her tongue for a long time. Charles, why do you dislike me so much? Why do you treat me like this? Charles was taken aback by the question and opened his mouth to answer when Camille got into the car. Letting in the cold air, the tension from the silence, the huge line immediately disappeared. From where only? It's evening. Let's go, Charles. Mom doesn't want to call an ambulance. Waiting for me quietly, Camille said, clutching the little button on the phone in her hand. The question remained undistracted. Camille was driven home. She gave a cursory thank you to the supervisor who had decided to help her and ran out into the driveway. Now to your house. Jenna. The girl nodded. Give me the exact address again. She said the address and was silent. In the car, there was again a sepulchral silence, broken only by the sound of water on the glass. It was starting to rain. A few minutes later, Charles sighed, breaking the invisible wall between himself and the girl. We are not prejudiced against you, Jenna. The girl cocked an eyebrow skeptically again. She loved that gesture in general. Learned it from a teacher in the French literature department. He always reacted very vividly to his students' aphorisms. I didn't like the way you answered me on the first day, so Kostya and I decided to test your stamina. Besides, we really disliked the criticism of Valera's translations and the desire to throw out his stuff. First of all, he'll be back at work as soon as he can. Don't worry, you won't be fired if you don't like yourself. And secondly, Valera's a friend of ours from the bone. He's been with the firm for years, since the day I had my first negotiation. He was still a green kid then, and now he's the godfather of a bone child. So you must understand our grievances towards you. She was silent. She stared at the raindrops on the glass and remained silent. She assumed it was about the past interpreter, but she didn't know the gravity of the situation. A moment later, Jenna swallowed a viscous saliva, folded her hands, and as if against her will she spoke. I should apologize for speaking harshly about your friend. I really haven't been with the firm long enough to criticize him. Besides, I should have been more polite when we first met." Charles wanted to say something, but the girl kept her mouth shut. "But I still don't think that's a reason to pick on me for little things." Charles grinned and shook his head. "You're incorrigible." "Jenna, why were you fired from your previous job?" "For temper." Specific. Jenna wondered for a moment if she should tell the truth, but she decided it wouldn't do any harm. "At my last job, it was simple. I was being harassed, or rather, harassed by my boss. He thought that since I work for him, he has the right to do with me whatever comes into his head, and I did not tolerate it and left. And the job before last, it made me chuckle. It was bullying. My translations were criticized constantly, and I wanted to leave on my own. But after I refused to translate the book, 101 Rules of Raising a Good Wife, I was fired. I didn't have time to apply early." Charles laughed quietly. He spun the steering wheel and shook his head. "Are you really a girl of character? Jenna, it must be hard for you to live." "Not at all. I know what I want. Appreciate myself and my time, but it's hardly that." Jenna looked questioningly at Charles. "You got into my car. You certainly don't value time." He was right. Jenna could have already been home and watching new episodes of the series on TV. However, she sat in her boss's car and talked about her life. It was completely absurd. After the most bizarre conversation with her supervisor, Jenna noticed that if the attitude towards her did not become perfect, it still improved. It was in the details. For example, James is no longer picky about her appearance. Girls checking the length of her skirt. And Charles no longer sent an assistant to check what she was talking about with customers while he was away. The only thing that hadn't changed at all was Charles' look. He stood on the threshold of his office and watched Jenna work. She didn't understand it. Charles, on the other hand, was amused by the situation. It had been a long time since he had met a girl who listed to him, and not just listed, but summoned him, saying poignant phrases, and making him feel uncomfortable. James then more than once recalled Charles, every venomous phrase said by the girl. It made him turn his attention to Jenna again and again to think of a worthy response. But never once did he succeed in doing so. In general, Charles eventually began to memorize some details about Jenna. For example, she was a terrible perfectionist at work, arranging pencils and pens by color. Her desk was always in perfect order. She never scattered things, much less threw papers. Jenna was also a very punctual worker. She was never once late for a meeting or to work after the first day. In addition, she never missed a deadline. Perhaps this was a personal trait of hers, or perhaps a consequence of working in a publishing house. There was one other small detail that pleaded with Charles. She walked to work in high-heeled shoes, never in ballet shoes or boots. But in her office, when she was doing long and agonizing work, drafting the contract or translating a presentation, she shuffled under her desk as long as no one could see. In a small cabinet, she had a pair of pink house slippers and soft black ballet flats. Sometimes she freaked out on purpose when she realized she had a long job ahead of her. And sometimes it especially surprised Charles. She did it machine-like. She would take off her shoes, put one foot under herself, and change her neck. This gesture became her hallmark. And it seemed so strange and homely. Against the serious and professional Jenna, the end of the workday had long since come, but Charles was still finishing up with the accounting reports. The coming audit from the IRS was making him double-check everything several times. When it was already dark outside and no one was left in the office, Charles threw away the third cup of coffee and headed for the exit. It was worth it to sleep at home for at least a few hours. In the hallway, Charles noticed a light coming from Jenna's office. He looked inside and saw that the girl was sitting at the desk with her head bent over the papers. She was making pencil marks on the paper now and then. Her thin lips were lined with pink lipstick. Something was being urgently spoken, and the tired eyes spoke. The light from the small table lamp was clearly lacking. Charles coughed. Jenna twitched and turned fearfully towards the door. 20 o'clock, Jenna said. Charles, it seems like you should have been home a long time ago. Jenna lost her eyes and nodded. She turned tiredly towards the round big band wall clock on which the big hand was actually pointing to 8. Jenna shifted her gaze to the desk, unfamiliarly filled, haphazardly layered with papers. Then to the clock again. And back to the desk. I hadn't been keeping track of the time. That doesn't usually happen to me. James said I had to finish translating the presentation by tomorrow. My brain exploded so much. No, shook his head Jenna. It's horribly written, just horribly. It's like a 5-year-old was composing. It doesn't matter. I'm almost done though. There's not much left. The girl yawned again. Charles shook his head and went into the study. He took a small foam from the desk, took his bag off the desk and threw the foam into it. Let's pack up and head home. We have an important presentation tomorrow, you understand. We need sleep, not sitting in the office at night. But no, Jenna, come on, I'll drive you and go home myself. She tilted her head and raised an eyebrow. Why? The man splayed his hands and smiled with the corner of his lips. In case you find a job on the way and I'll be late for your presentation tomorrow. Okay. After a while, Charles still managed to drag Jenna out of the office. She didn't want to leave without cleaning up her workstations. The man pressed the first floor button on the elevator and leaned against the wall. The elevator slowly began to descend. Silence ensued, interrupted only by the grinding of the vacation mechanism. When the second floor button lit up, telling that the exit was coming soon, Jenna prepared to get out as the elevator and suddenly stopped abruptly. The girl staggered. She had to grab Charles' arm to keep from falling. What the hell was Charles cursing out? He started to press the button to call the dispatcher. There was a long silence at first. The men glanced over to Jenna. Then he pressed it again. There was a low hiss, and slowly a disgruntled voice said, "Dispatcher on the line, what do you need?" "We're stuck in the elevator in the 3rd building." "The office of this company, what's its name?" "Construction Plus," Charles said, eyeing the smirking Jenna. Yeah, they're a bunch of majors," the dispatcher muttered. Jenna jumped with laughter, covering her mouth with the palm of her hand. "Expecting a handyman within the hour." "How long?" Charles asked in surprise. 9 o'clock in the evening." "Man, what did you want?" The woman kept muttering something into the microphone, but it was hard to recognize. After a second, the speaker went dead. "Looks like we're out of luck again," Charles complained. Jenna sighed. She took out a thick, warm shawl from her bag. She spread it out and sat down. "You'll be standing for an hour." Charles was taken aback. Jenna patted the edge of the shawl, then turned away. Quietly laughed Jenna. "Like in the novels," replied the girl. Charles just at this time decided to sit down on the shawl. The situation is like a cheap love story. You know, the kind they sell for pennies. "Do you get carried away with your arms folded across your chest?" asked the man. "I tried to read once. It was a stupid youth. Those novels are predictable. And you know, they always have a scene in an elevator or in a hotel where the rooms have run out. After you've read a couple of books like that, you begin to realize that all the plots are the same." Charles chuckled, "But women like it. I was going to be a philologist first, and so I read a lot of very diverse literature, which does not compare with such novels." The girl thought about it though. They're not bad for clearing your mind. You know, when completely devastated after what happens in life, only such literature and saves. There are perfect men in it, and a happy ending. And a prince in the form of a dragon. Charles laughed. "Maybe I should try reading those novels of yours too. There's so much going on in life that sometimes you want to dream of something good. You've had some bad things in your life, haven't you?" The man thought for a second. "I don't know if I should tell you." But at the last moment, he decided he had nothing to lose. "I didn't have a big and strong family when I was growing up. I dreamed of one in my future. It didn't work out for a long time. But then I met a wonderful girl named Emily. We got married, she had a baby. And then Charles stammered. And then I found out it wasn't my baby. Honestly, it was the worst news I'd ever gotten. Even my mother's death wasn't as painful. She'd been sick for a long time, and everyone was waiting for the news. But it was like I was given a chance at a normal life, and then taken away." Jenna sat silently for a while. She didn't say anything, not because she had nothing to say. She could think of 1,000,000 words, but they weren't needed here. "My fiancé died a month before the wedding. I was 22. Jenna exhaled and turned her back to the wall, staring at her crooked reflection. It's a different kind of pain, I'm sure. You can't compare those things. But in all cases, the pain subsides. They say time heals. But it doesn't. It doesn't heal a damn thing. It just buries the grief with problems and routine. It's forgotten, but it only takes a second for the mind to dive into the memories. The whole fucking cure goes to hell. Charles was silent too. There was complete silence. No one moved or spoke. It was as if something outside had silenced the two men. Several minutes passed like that. Then Charles, wanting to lighten the oppressive atmosphere, began to tell some stories. But soon he felt Jenna's almost weightless head fall on his shoulder. Her red hair, disgorged from her hairstyle, fluttered around the man's jacket. The leader opened the doors as promised. An hour later, he found a man and a girl sitting on the floor, sleeping peacefully with their heads resting on each other. Old man Lester in the proper blue overalls woke Charles and Jenna. The girl looked around in incomprehension, looking around. Then she stumbled over to Charles and the shawl. Memories began to return to the redhead, and Jenna hurriedly got up, gathering her things. The way to the car was very quick and quiet. No one said a word to each other. Charles remembered the way to Jenna's house and did not ask her anything. When the car reached the desired address, no one got out of the car. Once again, there was an awkward silence and strange looks. You know, Jenna, after what we've been through, we're going to have to switch to the first name. Do you mind? Jenna shook her head. I don't mind, Charles. Your car is fine with me, so you can keep driving me home. With these words and a slight smile, the girl got out of the car. She walked without turning around all the way to the driveway. Her back was shockingly straight. It was as if she were made of metal. Charles followed the girl with a glance. He realized, catching himself, that he liked her. He liked her phrasing, her pertinent silence, and her red hair. The man was long past 18, but now he was ready to feel like a boy who had decided on a hit on a girl. For an entire week, Charles had dared to take Jenna to the theater. He bought tickets for Romeo and Juliet, vaguely remembering the plot, but knowing full well that the production was good. All week, he's been walking around the girl's office, getting on her nerves. At one point, she flew out into the hallway, squinted, looked at the man, and said everything loud enough to be heard. It seems you, Charles, have a lot of important business to attend to during working hours instead of pointlessly loitering in the corridors. Kindly leave my sight. Otherwise, you won't understand a single word at the presentation. Without waiting for a response, Jenna turned and walked back out, slamming the door loudly. Charles saw only the way her red braid flashed in front of her. At the end of the week, after much negotiation, a deal was struck with the Germans. The delegation had its own interpreter, but Charles decided to take Jenna just in case. In general, he had his own interest, but he explained it to her this way. The negotiations were just a formality and took place again in that restaurant on Nevsky Prospect, which the French had once liked very much. The whole evening, Jenna was frankly bored, but tried not to show it. At some point, the head of the German delegation decided that Jenna was Charles' wife. The girl wanted to assure him, but the man only said that they were a beautiful couple and left the dinner. That's not right, Jenna protested. It shouldn't be like this. Don't you understand, Charles? We're not husband and wife. You can't cheat. If cheating helps the company, you can. Believe me, you can do anything, as long as there's a profit to be made. Really? Jenna asked quietly. The girl was sitting at dinner in a long black evening dress with the usual heels. She looked beautiful from behind her bobbed hair. Charles could not help but appreciate her image. When the German delegation left the dinner completely, only Charles and Jenna were left at the table. James, siding business, left even earlier than the Germans themselves. Jenna wanted to get up from the table, but the quiet voice of Charles stopped her. Jenna, Emily, how do you feel about the theater? Positive. The girl answered cautiously. I don't know what to say. I happen to have 2 tickets to the theater. You seem to be dressed for the occasion, as I am. Charles looked around the girl's outfit and his own. Jenna asked casually. Charles nodded in agreement. Well, if it's casual, why let it go to waste, right? Besides, I really like this play. Come on. Charles got up from the table and put his arm around the girl. helping her up. Jenna nodded gratefully. The production was wonderful. Jenna looked at the stage for the whole hour and a half. There were no interruptions, only a single beautiful performance. But Charles looked only at Jenna, at her brilliant eyes, at the smile and dimples on her cheeks. She greedily absorbed every word. The actors insatiably gazed at the stage, dropping tears every time the lead actress scored. After the play, Jenna and Charles walked out of the theater into the cold autumn air. The girl wrapped her coat more tightly around her, threw on her hood, and breathed in the not yet frosty, but already icy air. "Winter is coming," Charles said. Harder, too, tangled in his coat. "It's early, don't you think?" Jenna turned to the man on a frown. A look of incomprehension was written on her face. She seemed to have listened at all. What Charles had said. She shook her head and nodded after a second. Soon she agreed. "Well, no, not soon at all. It's November. Should I drive you home or?" Jenna hesitated for a moment. Then she looked at Charles and grinned. "Would you mind taking a walk?" The man was taken aback. "It's been a long time since I've just walked the streets. It seems like such a simple thing to do every day, but it doesn't work out. Usually girls ask me to take them to a restaurant after the theater. Do you?" Jenna tilted his head. "I don't want to go to a restaurant. You know, I take my clients to restaurants to negotiate. And it's getting kind of annoying, to be honest." Charles put up his elbow. Jenna put her hand on it and smiled. Why not? Watching foreigners come to Russia and ask to be served Russian food. It's strange, but it's even scarier to see that they end up getting pancakes with black red caviar. Isn't that crazy? Restaurants are an idealized island. I love going to them, reading huge menus with weird names and gorgeous decor. But sometimes it's better to just walk along the waterfront, breathing in the carbon dioxide-soaked air, and watching the crowds of people rushing about, even at this late hour. Charles nodded, smiling. He was actually listening to the girl in his ear. He liked just like that and kind of Cold Street, not thinking about work and worries. That hadn't happened in far too long. There was a sudden calmness on his soul. There was a warmth in his chest. Bad thoughts faded into the background. It felt great. When the clock struck 12 o'clock, it was time to go home. So Jenna and Charles walked back to the car. The girl took the seat next to the driver, joking that it was time to put a sign with her name on it. "I don't mind driving you around," noticed Charles. "Turns the car around any time." Jenna didn't answer anything, just turned away to the window. The girl wouldn't admit to anyone that she liked Charles. He was a mature, wealthy man who really knew what he wanted. He reeked of strength and reasonableness. It was attractive, and Jenna couldn't stop thinking about him. She was both amazed and intimidated by the looks the man threw at her at work. But at the same moment, she waited greedily. She waited for Charles to speak to her again or offer her a ride. Deep down, the girl realized that she was already a woman, and that she was 30 years old, clearly not the age to wait for a romantic love story or a fairy tale in the style of tabloid novels. However, there was hope. The desire to relive those feelings that she had buried in herself long ago after the death of her fiancé overpowered all other emotions. And so Jenna sat in the car of the boss, who unknown what he thought of her. She was sure he liked her, but she couldn't say for sure. Was this a real thing? Or just another whim from a wealthy man? Jenna sincerely hoped for the former, because she wanted to believe in happy endings and love. "You won't. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, Charles." Jenna was indignant. "What will the neighbors think of me?" Charles turned his body toward Jenna and leaned slightly toward her to whisper in her face. "Everyone sleeps. Who doesn't? Obviously not judging you. Or do you disagree?" Jenna folded her saliva heavily, looking straight into the man's deep brown eyes that were like two stray saucers. Blood rushed to the girl's head. She blushed, but at the same moment she couldn't think. Memories of Charles' gaze flashed through her mind, memories of their bickering and their shared work. For a second, Jenna pitched forward, but then immediately darted back. "I have a mess at home, Charles. Next time." Jenna quickly exited the car, slamming the door. She walked off into her driveway again, without turning around. Charles smiled crookedly, staring at the girl's tense back. She had him so hooked that it was simply impossible to get off her hook. Charles flipped through Jenna's file several times, and the only thing he remembered was the date of her birth, November 13th, a day that had come very quickly. Charles prepared for it thoroughly by booking a table in a restaurant and ordering the most beautiful, in his assistant's opinion, bouquet of flowers. All day, November 13, Charles acted as if he had no idea that it was his employee's birthday. She, however, showed no sign of it either. "What did you expect, Charles?" James grinned. "That she'd show up in a birthday hat and hand out candy like she was in kindergarten. Well, you're a real piece of work, old man. I thought you understood the seriousness of this girl." Charles did. That was the point. He understood her thoughts and her thinking. He found books by Tolstoy, Dumas, Goethe, and the Bronte sisters in her study. Jenna loved serious literature, beautiful plays in the theater, and romantic songs. At the same time, the girl was able to support any conversation, inserting clever and sometimes sharp phrases so successfully that it seemed as if she had rehearsed these conversations. At such moments, Charles could not take his eyes off the faces of Jenna's interlocutors, who looked around in incomprehension and discouragement. Toward the end of the day, James loaded Jenna with work, ordering her to do it before evening. The girl muttered something about the lack of conscience of supervisors, but did not develop this topic further. Accepted for work, Charles placed a bouquet of fragrant spies under the door of Jenna's office and left a small note on which he wrote the address. There was a knock on the door. He left for the elevator, wanting to wait for the girl there. Ono tiredly swung the doors open and slammed her eyes shut in surprise, finding no one there. Then her gaze came across the bouquet. The girl's head tilted and her eyes squinted. She bent down to pull out the note. "And when you read it?" Her lips stretched into a smile. Jenna shook her head, but picked up the bouquet and carried it into the study, setting the vase down. She glanced at the desk piled with work, but waved it away, realizing who had set it up, throwing her coat on. The girl walked towards the elevator, where her smiling boss was already waiting for her. "How do you like the flowers?" "I hope I guessed. They're gorgeous. So we're going to the restaurant." Jenna tilted his head slightly. "So corny, don't you think?" "You haven't seen this restaurant," Charles said, waving his hand in an inviting gesture. "I wanted to take you to the ballet or the opera. But today, to my deepest regret, I couldn't find anything that would attract our attention. But the restaurant is beautiful. Trust me on this one. I would never take foreigners wanting to try Russian food." Jenna smiled and stepped into the elevator. There were several voices fighting in the girl's head. One particularly suspicious one was saying it was too early to trust Charles. The other, dreaming of romance, said the opposite. It was the one Jenna decided to listen to. "Do you think we'll sleep here again this time?" Jenna laughed softly, but her laughter was interrupted by a grinding sound. The elevator jerked and stopped again. "What the?" Charles and Jenna stood in silence for a moment, but the elevator didn't move. The man laughed loudly, shaking his head. "Did you have a carrot chop?" Jenna chortled indignantly. "I'm a crow for you to carcass, just this damn elevator needs to be repaired. And you don't want to spend money on it. It's not my building, I don't have to fix this elevator. It gets stuck in it." We grumbled to the girl. "That's the second time it's happened. Damn it. On my birthday." Charles fumbled for the girl's hand in the dim light of the single lamp and pulled her to him. "Would you like to spend it with me huskily?" Charles asked, leaning in close to the girl's ear. Goosebumps ran down the girl's body. She tried to free her hand, but nothing worked. "I don't mind surrendering," Jenna replied. Charles leaned down to the girl's face, greedily beginning to kiss her. He wrapped his hands around the back of Jenna's head, burying his hands in her disintegrating hair. Her lips were so soft he couldn't pull away. Her hair was so silky clean, he didn't want to let her go. Her sighs were so seductive he couldn't help but obey. The elevator jerked and went. Charles let go of Jenna, and she bounced her lip off of him. She was shot and absent-mindedly ran her hand over her face. "Charles, you know this. It shouldn't." The man took a step toward her and with one gesture told the girl to be quiet. This was serious, and I wanted to be serious. "If you don't mind, of course." "I don't mind," Jenna blurted out quietly. contrary to the suspicious voice that was now silent for some reason. It had been almost 3 months since the kiss in the elevator. Those 3 months had been simply wonderful for both Charles and Jenna. Was it the first time since her fiancé's death that the girl had felt such emotions? No, she had had a relationship afterward, but it had been ordinary, not like this. Kissing in the meeting room, quiet conversations, and sitting around during lunch breaks, going to the theater together. Every minute spent with Charles made Jenna feel like the luckiest girl on earth. She looked at the actors who played love on stage and began to believe that her destiny was sitting next to her. A flurry of emotions and feelings clouded the girl's mind. She refused to accept reality, wanting to dissolve into what was happening to her. Charles, who rightfully considered himself a grown man, felt like a 17-year-old boy. All those secrets from the workers, the timid encounters, and the bright flashes. It was all strange and, one might say, new to him. He never thought he'd ever feel it again. Charles even began to spend less time at work, much to the surprise of James, who had only grinned at his friends flailing on the day Charles and Jenna were supposed to be 3 months into their relationship. A man decided to make a serious step, and to prepare everything for such an amazing event for him, he decided to take a friend with him. "You think I'm dealing with all this lady's stuff? I don't even know what to call it," resented James, standing in front of the counter with rings, bracelets, and other jewelry. "And anyway, Dim, are you sure? Tell me." Charles was looking at one of the rings with a green stone. He tried to imagine if the stone would fit Charles. It seemed to him that it would. After all, the green would go perfectly with her lovely red hair. "You're not a boy anymore to make a spontaneous decision like that. I'm not even 40, and you've already made me an old man." James ran his palm over his face and sighed. He'd never realized that his friend, always serious and stern, could turn into a lover. It's not so much about age as it is about how your last marriage ended. Besides, you haven't even told her about yours. James stopped talking, not knowing what to call his friend's problem. "I'll tell her about the infertility the day I propose, and if she doesn't want to deal with me, I'll understand and get out of her life. And if she doesn't care, I'll have a ring ready to go." James simply stepped further away from Charles, not wanting to continue the conversation. He was happy for his friend, knowing full well that he was happy. But he was also afraid for him. He was afraid that he would fall into apathy, as he had last time, and stop communicating with the world, that he would get bogged down in his work and never get out of it again. A few days later, on the cherished day, Charles prepared dinner, set the table, put candles on the table, and made the most romantic setting possible. He didn't want to take Jenna to a restaurant. He didn't think it was necessary. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed an intimate setting. Jenna arrived exactly the minute Charles was expecting her. She was as punctual as always, not a second late. The girl was all red and a little shot. She missed the bus and had to run to the next stop, which made it very difficult. However, on the first day she met Charles, she had promised him never to be late ever. The girl threw off her warm winter coat. Charles helped her hang it on the coat rack. He saw Jenna in a long emerald dress that matched her hair perfectly. Charles nervously touched the box with the ring in his pocket. It was the same green stone. The man considered it a sign of fate. Jenna and Charles sat down to dinner. On the table was forbidden duck with vegetables and a few salads, and also a bottle of expensive wine that Charles had been given by one of his French partners. But the girl didn't drink wine. She was nervous. And Charles noticed that she answered his questions one-wordedly and often lost the small mole on the thumb of her left hand, a sign that Jenna was worried. The man remembered her because he himself had the same one, but on his right hand. It was another sign of fate. He was sure of it. Half an hour later, Charles decided it was time. "I have something to tell you," Jenna said loudly. She raised her head high and merged. Charles nodded his head, deciding that his conversation could wait. "I saw a doctor today, a gynecologist." Charles' heart skipped a beat. His gaze froze. "Anyway, I'm pregnant. You and I are going to have a baby." Charles was silent. There was a mask of impenetrability on his face, but inside, everything turned upside down, ripped away, and split into 100 little pieces. His hands clutched the tablecloth under the table with force. He was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he didn't want to believe what she was saying. No, finally shook his head. We're not having a baby. Jenna frowned and stared at Charles uncomprehendingly. What's wrong? Did you decide to leave me or something? I don't understand. Dump me, of course. I'm not going to put up with your lies. Charles spoke harshly. He slowly got up from the table and walked closer to Anna. The man poked the girl in the stomach with his finger, to which she poked loudly. Not my child, I can't have children. That's a diagnosis, which Jenna interjected. Her face reflected confusion. Look, there's some kind of mistake. I went to the doctor, he said I'm pregnant, but it wasn't mine. Honey, spit it out venomously. Charles, you're just another lying bastard. Just like Emily, just like all the others. You're all the same. Jenna rose from the table. She screamed about how Charles was wrong, that he was talking nonsense, but he wouldn't listen to her. He raised his hand and pointed his finger at the door. Go away. Jenna reached for Charles with her hand, but he roughly pushed her away. Get out of here. Jenna took her coat from the coat rack with trembling hands and walked toward the door. She tried to say something against it, but Charles wouldn't listen. He threw curses at her. Then he took a red box out of his pocket and threw it at the girl. But the box hit the door, which had closed, and bounced off of her. As it fell to the floor, it swung open. A thin gold ring with a green stone rolled across the floor. The man followed it with his gaze. The ring glistened in the light as if out of spite. Playing with Charles, his feelings were shattered, trampled, as if they had never existed. All that was left was a searing, unrelenting pain that wouldn't let up for a second. And it was unbearable. The day Jenna told him she was pregnant was fateful for Charles. James' worst fears were realized. His best friend turned into a flatulent, cold, emotionless track who felt nothing. There were no more marriages for Charles, only random one-offs, which soon ended as well. He plunged headlong into work. The firm went from strength to strength. Charles himself, on the contrary, became anything but himself. His strength was gone. And that's what scared James the most. Every day of his life, James thought of the woman who had broken his best friend's heart. She gave him a chance and then took it away. Charles couldn't bear it a second time. James remembered it even when he was lying on white sheets in the hospital and slowly dying in front of his friend. 25 years after what happened to Charles, James died. He lived a happy life with his wife. He became Charles' full partner and the father of the boy who followed in his footsteps. But James himself inherited heart problems from his mother, and right in front of his family he passed away. After his funeral, Charles was walking from the cemetery. He wasn't going to go to the wake. He didn't want to listen to people who didn't know James at all give speeches about what a good man he was. It would be unbearable. Charles, who had already visited, was walking down the sidewalk with a bottle of cognac and drinking it straight from his throat. The man had changed considerably in 25 years, losing his posture and growing a small belly. He didn't look 20 years old, and the death of his best friend had made him lose the last vestiges of self-control. Charles took another sip with his eyes clenched shut. Suddenly, a bicycle rode by him at full speed. The boy didn't even stop to apologize. Charles lost his balance. He flailed his arms helplessly and cried out. A look of horror froze on his face. He flew straight into the road. The thought flashed through his mind that Charles would run into James. But at the last moment, someone grabbed his arm and pulled him to the sidewalk. Charles spun his gaze into the hand of the guy who was holding him. His eyes locked on a birthmark just like his own on his left arm. Charles' mind cleared in a second. He tossed the bottle of brandy aside and grabbed the guy's other arm. There was a birthmark on that arm too. A memory from 25 years ago popped into my mind. Charles cocked his head and looked up at his savior. It was a tall, red-haired guy whose face made Charles cringe. It was as if he looked at a youthful photograph of himself. His brown eyes, wide nose, massive eyebrows. Everything was exactly the same. Charles opened his mouth to ask the guy's name, but then stepped away from him. Don't walk the streets drunk anymore. It's not safe. The guy yelled and ran off. He was wearing a medic's uniform, blue suit. The guy ran towards the hospital. And writing Charles was left standing alone on the sidewalk, staring at the back of the guy running away. The next day, Charles ordered Vicky's assistant. Camille had long since quit after finding a job in her specialty. Find the names of all the young doctors at the hospital near the cemetery where James was buried. A few hours later, there was a list on Charles's desk. Sebastian, a pediatrician recently arrived after graduation, was one of 3 young specialists at the hospital. Charles dropped the list when he read the name. His hands began to shake, and he reached for his whiskey glass. But at the last moment, he changed his mind and pulled his hand away. His gaze locked on the name again. Jenna. She'd named her son after his father. Sebastian. She'd given him his middle name. Calmly, Charles called out to Wendy. Find me all the information about the pediatrician, Street Luke's Hospital, about Sebastian. Wendy nodded and ran off. Doubts crept into Charles' head, but the striking similarity of the medal put them to rest. Besides, the birthmarks could be thought to be both from their mother. But it seemed to Charles that they weren't. Am I wrong? Charles asked quietly to himself. You old fool. Charles wrapped his arms around his head, trying to chase away the haunting memories of red hair, bright eyes, and a sweet smile. Charles had enough money to hire a private investigator who had no trouble following the guy and taking his DNA. One little hair was able to answer all of Charles' questions. The data that Wendy had found suggested that the mother was Sebastian Jenna, a translator and linguist who had been working as a French teacher for the last few years. Then the lab tests came back. 99%. Charles squeezed the sheet with force. He couldn't believe that he had a chance for a happy family and a son. But he'd driven it away, made himself lose it. I could have had a son. Charles shook his head. Wendy found Sebastian's social media accounts. Charles sat and leafed through photos of the boy who turned out to be his son. They were cheerful photos from college and work. The guy took a lot of pictures, seeing beauty even where there was none. His mother appeared in some of the pictures, a short, gray-haired woman with a straight back and a strict bundle on her head. Nowhere was there a word about his father. Jenna raised her son alone. For a long time, Charles did not know what he should do. He told him to keep an eye on his son. But then, realizing the futility of this activity, he canceled the surveillance. The man found out all the information about Jenna and Sebastian. They didn't live well, but they weren't poor. The woman tried her best to give her son a decent life. She worked as a translator for a company and a publishing house, and also worked part-time as a tutor. She brought up her son perfectly. Sebastian went to medical school on a budget, graduated, started to work in the 2nd year, and also helped in the animal shelter and participated in various campaigns. Charles could not believe that this boy was his son. He was so cheerful and kind that it seemed to the man as if he could not have given birth to such a person. He was right about something, though. It was his mother, not his father, who had made him that way. As unfortunate as that sounds, you should have seen it. Costia shook his head. Charles would definitely have laughed at me and called me a stupid old gray-haired fool. Charles recognized Jenna's address at once, but he did not dare to go there for a long time. He was sure he couldn't make it that easily. He was right about that, though. You can't come back 25 years after what you've done and still have a claim. But one day he decided to do it. He wanted Sebastian to know that he had a father, even if he hated him for what Charles had done to his mother. Charles stood on the doorstep of the apartment and hesitated to ring the bell. He did so only after some long arm came out of the neighboring apartment and shook his fist. Look, Hirad, what a mistake. The old woman asked loudly, and Charles quickly pressed the bell button. The door was not open for a long time. Then the lock turned and Charles saw an older woman standing in front of him. Her hair was red again, but only faded dyed. Her face was covered in wrinkles, and her eyes stared dully before her. Despite all the changes, this was still his Jenna. Beautiful and insanely statuesque, with a straight back, a high chin, long fingers, and a wisp of hair draped over her head. The woman pulled on her glasses and looked in front of her, and for a moment she awed and took a few steps back in surprise. Charles, the man nodded. He reached out his hand to touch Jenna, to see if she was real, but the woman immediately sent it back. "What do you want?" "Forgive me, Jenna," a lump caught in Charles's throat. "I can explain everything." The door slammed right in Charles' face. She didn't say anything, just slammed the door. Again, the man walked outside and sat down on a bench. It was old and shabby, but he didn't care. Charles didn't know what he should do. Didn't know how to beg forgiveness for the deed he had done. He didn't understand at all. "She will never forgive me," Charles said quietly, lowering his head and staring at the asphalt. A ringing voice sounded above the man's head. He looked up and saw Sebastian. "Did something happen to you?" Charles could not answer anything. He just stared at the boy in silence, speechless. "You're the man who almost fell under the car." "Hello," Sebastian extended his hand to Charles. Charles shook his hand and nodded. "It's a long story. The guy is old and nasty. Go home. You have no business listening to me." Sebastian grinned and sat down next to Charles. "Tell it. I love long old stories. Go ahead. Will it make you feel better?" Charles shook his head. He was sure it wouldn't. It would. As a doctor, basic psychology, you can't keep everything inside. "When you know my story, you won't want to talk to me." Charles shook his head again. "I've been to the autopsy of a corpse. Nothing can scare me anymore." Charles thought about what he should do. He wanted to talk to his son, to get to know him. But he couldn't. He couldn't do it for several reasons. First of all, the obstacle was Jenna. Charles could not tell his son the truth without her knowledge. In the second, he saw no point in Sebastian getting to know him. The boy didn't need him, just the opposite. Charles waved his hand and began to tell from the beginning. He talked about Letha and the betrayal, about Jenna and the pregnancy, about the death of a friend. He didn't mention names, speaking in a detached way, as if Sebastian had nothing to do with it. "And then I find out years later that it was actually my son, that he's a grown boy now. And I rejected her for nothing and made a terrible mistake, and I don't know what to do, what to say or where to go. She won't forgive me and he won't accept me. I'm sure of it. I'm an old fool." Sebastian sighed. He looked down at the man in front of him. "You were foolish, of course. You should have checked it out before you sent her away. But anyway, it's your son. She may not forgive her right, but the boy needs to know about his father. What good would that do him?" Charles asked. "He's grown up and on his own, and I'm a decrepit old man." Sebastian grinned and stretched out his arm. "See, that's a birthmark." Charles nodded, covering his hand with it from his father. "When I was a kid, my mom used to say he was dead. But the older I got, the more I realized she was lying. People don't die without a trace. We don't even have any pictures of him. Maybe he got cold feet and ran away. Or maybe it was a casual connection. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm 24 years old. I'm an adult. I'm a guy like your son. But frankly, I'd give anything in the world to see my dad, to know him, why he left my mom. That's a guy who can take it. But all I've got, that's all I can do. And your son has the hope of seeing you fully, and you can't take that chance away from him." For a few minutes, Sebastian and Charles sat in silence. Then the boy got up from the bench and held out his hand to the man. "Let's say goodbye. I hope things get better for you." Charles extended his right hand without thinking about what he was doing. Sebastian's gaze fell on a birthmark just like his own. The boy froze, shifting his gaze from his hand to the man's. Charles pulled his hand out sharply and wanted to walk away, but a strong hand stopped him, grabbing his shoulder. "Are you Charles?" The man nodded. "How did you tell me my story?" The boy let go of the man and rushed into the entryway. Charles didn't know what he should do. Remembering Jenna's icy stare, he went to the car. He didn't belong here. It had been 3 days since Charles had gone to see Jenna. Guilt had taken over him. He didn't know what he needed to do to make things right. He ended up doing nothing, secretly watching the guy's social media. One day, Charles was going to a meeting with a real estate developer in his office. He was about to leave when he heard Wendy's voice. "Charles, there's a guy here to see you. Claims he's your son." The briefcase fell from Charles' hands. He looked at the door in surprise and said hoarsely, "Let him in." A few minutes later, Sebastian stood in front of him. "Have you escaped again?" The boy said quietly, "Just like we did 25 years ago." Chickened out. But I, Charles, breathed heavily. "You don't need me. They'll never accept me." Sebastian angrily threw the bag on the floor. "If you don't try, yes, never. But even if Mom never forgives you, what about me? Am I not worthy of knowing my father?" Charles was out of breath. His heart skipped a beat. "Is that what you want?" "Aya, I came here against my mother's wishes because I'm ready to know you, even after everything you've done." Charles smiled broadly and took a few steps toward Sebastian. "But don't be deceived. I have my mother's temper." The boy walked away, leaving Charles alone. For the next few months, Sebastian and Charles met in different places. Sometimes Sebastian would come to the firm and see what his father had built. The boy told a lot of things about himself and Jenna. Charles would talk about what it was like before Vi was born. Sebastian eventually stopped treating Charles as someone who had hurt his mother. He was generally a forgiving guy, willing to make contact, which pleased Charles. The man had postponed negotiations, canceled meetings, was late for meetings in order to meet with his son. Now he wanted to make up for lost time, and Sebastian was letting him do it. He introduced his father to his girlfriend, showed him the apartment he wanted to rent, turned down the money Charles offered him. No need for payoffs, Sebastian shook his head. In one of their meetings, Sebastian pulled out of his backpack a ticket to a production of Romeo and Juliet. Charles was flooded with memories at the sight of the ticket. "I bought the ticket, and they put me on duty. For me, and my mom said she'd already seen it." Charles was happy to accept the ticket from his son. He could take anything from him as long as the boy wasn't disappointed in him. Charles went to the theater that weekend. It was the same place he had been with Jenna. The man was nostalgic again, but he decided to ignore it. It had been happening a lot lately. By the third bell, the seat next to Charles was taken by a woman with red hair and a severe bundle on her head. "Jenna." The woman turned toward Charles and froze in surprise. Then her face reflected understanding. Asshole as only she could. Started to resent Jenna, but immediately fell silent. The lights went out. Charles sat through the whole performance on pins and needles. Every now and then he glanced at the woman sitting next to him. She never once turned her head, looking only at the stage and the actors. This evening, however, there was no looking into the performance, not Charles, not Jenna. As soon as the actors bowed, Jenna took a bullet out of the auditorium. Eager to get as far away from Charles as possible, the man caught up with her and grabbed her arm. "Jenna." The woman turned sharply and gave the man an icy stare. "I can tell you everything. Sasha told me everything a long time ago. You don't have to try. Woman, do you really think it's worth it to tell a tearful tale of betrayal? How am I going to forget how I raised my son alone for 20 years? There's no forgetting that, believe me." Jenna turned and walked away. Charles stood staring at her back again. But then Sebastian's words came to his mind. "You must realize that if you act like a coward, you won't succeed. Mom won't forgive you. I won't be able to accept it if you don't want to come forward." Charles rushed after the woman. He caught her at the entrance, grabbing her by the edge of her coat. "Jenna, please forgive me." Jenna sighed heavily, looking at the man in front of her. "I'm guilty in front of you, guilty that I couldn't get over myself, that I didn't believe you. I'm even more guilty that my son was without a father for many years. You raised a fine boy with me, he wouldn't have grown up to be so wonderful." Charles took a breath. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. Just give me a chance. Since the day you left, I haven't had a single bright hour in my life. Everything was covered in darkness and I was alone. Then my best friend died and I gave up." She widened her eyes in surprise. "If it wasn't for my son, I'd be lying next to my friend in the damp earth right now, you know? I'm not asking you to forgive me. Just give me a chance. Please." Jenna looked at the burned, gray-haired man and shook her head. Tears flowed from her eyes, hatred, resentment, and self-pity. They were long gone, leaving only emptiness. For all 25 years, the woman had thought Charles was a villain, but now she saw only a broken man. "We can take a walk along the promenade," the woman said quietly and gave Charles her hand. And they walked on. They walked on, forgetting their grudges or not, no one knows. but they definitely walked on together.